toward the one, the perfection of love, harmony, and beauty, the only being united with all the illuminated souls who form the embodiment of the Master, the Spirit of guidance. And The Way of Illumination was an early book that was put together out of a series of articles from an early Sufi journal that was published from 1915 to 1920, with articles by Hazrat Inayat Khan and others. And then his articles were culled from it and put together in this volume. And then in this most recent a message volume that Saluk Press has put out in the last year, they've gone back to the originals and found the transcripts upon which articles were based and added in the question and answer sections. So there's added material. And then they were made gender inclusive. And so I only have I've gone through most of The Way of Illumination, and there are only 3 or 4 sections left. And tonight I thought we would tackle the section on belief. And then if there's time, a small section on the spirit of guidance. So Hazrat Inayat Khan says, "It is the nature of mind to believe, and disbelief comes after. No unbeliever has always been an unbeliever. For if a soul from childhood should disbelieve, one would never learn to speak. All knowledge that a person possesses has been acquired by belief. When one strengthens belief by knowledge, then comes disbelief in things that one's knowledge cannot cope with, and in things that one's reason cannot justify. A person then disbelieves things that were once believed in. Unbelievers are those who have changed their belief to disbelief. Disbelief often darkens the soul, but sometimes it illuminates it." So, just going back a little bit. It is the nature of the mind to believe, and disbelief comes after. So he's saying just that the mind tends to accept whatever comes at it. And then there's a critical faculty that only comes in afterwards, and then starts to doubt what was immediately given. So belief is positive, unbelief or disbelief is negative, not in a value judgment sense, but only in the sense of being assertive or receptive. So no unbeliever has always been an unbeliever. For if a soul from childhood should disbelieve, one would never even learn to speak. We have to have that kind of accepting quality in order to move forward and learn anything. All knowledge that a person possesses has been acquired by belief, that ability or that faculty to grab hold of something. When one strengthens belief by knowledge, having grabbed hold of something, then comes disbelief in things that one's knowledge cannot cope with, or things that one's reason cannot justify. So, belief is actually the thing that grabs hold of, that takes hold of something. But once you're holding it, there's something to measure by, something to work with. And only by that do we have any disbelief. And sometimes it's because reason can't justify something. There's not a good enough reason to believe in this thing once I have some knowledge about it. Or one's knowledge cannot cope with it. So it's too heavy a truth for you at a given moment. And so there's a rejection and disbelief around that. A person then disbelieves things that were once believed in. Unbelievers are those who have changed their belief to disbelief. Disbelief often darkens the soul, but also illuminates it. Sometimes darkens the soul, but also illuminates it. You know, and that's a lot about disappointment, disillusionment. But there's also an illumination to being disillusioned, to having a belief taken away. Then you enter into a wider reality. There's a greater knowledge, there's a greater illumination. But it can have this two-part effect. The soul can be darkened even as it's being illuminated by more knowledge. There's a Persian saying, until belief has changed to disbelief, and again the disbelief into a belief, a person does not become a real Muslim. Until a person has believed, then lost that belief, and then discovered a new belief, that person is not a truly spiritual person in this context. Well, you know, in a Muslim Sufi context, what are you going to talk about except being a Muslim? You know, so all they mean by that is a religious person or a spiritual person, a person who's truly rooted in their spiritual path. In the context of this saying, would just be a Muslim. One who is surrendered also. A Muslim is one who is surrendered. That's the literal meaning of the word. So, it's great to look at. A Muslim is not a believer. A Muslim is a believer who was a person who was once a believer, who then became an unbeliever, and then became a believer again. That's a Muslim. But a Muslim is not a believer.
Does the cycle repeat in this one? Like the Pendanium or
Yes, well, you have to go through this process. See, I mean, this is a Sufi saying, you know. Orthodox Islam will want to say, well, once you confess your belief, you're a believer, you're a Muslim. But what this is saying is that a true believer is someone who's lost their original belief, doubted, fallen away, and come back. That it's not a certain sort of knowledge, an arrogant sort of knowledge. It's been doubted, it's been washed with doubts, it's been knocked down and beaten up and gotten back up again. And the belief that comes second is not the belief that the same belief is that was there before.
Thesis, antithesis,
Synthesis, yes. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis. So a real faith has been tested and been lost. But when disbelief becomes a wall and stands against the further penetration of mind into life, then it darkens the soul, for there is no chance of further progress. Okay, so that's clear. When disbelief becomes a wall and stands against further penetration of mind into life, then it darkens the soul. So that disbelief has become a belief.
Right, exactly.
Where disbelief becomes a firm belief, and then all illumination stops. Because the process of thinking and critical thinking and discovery is all ended, and it darkens the soul, which is just another way of saying a person becomes ignorant. willfully ignorant, because they think they know. A person who is willfully ignorant is certain that they know. So disbelief, if held on to, is a block. In another instance, where one's pride and satisfaction in what one knows also limits the scope of one's vision. So that's where belief is a block. Pride in knowing and satisfaction in what one knows limits the scope of one's vision. So disbelief and belief, both wrong. Neither one is any good if held on to exclusively. Disbelief that becomes a belief is a problem. Belief that becomes a barrier to further knowing, also a problem, and then becomes a disbelief in any other knowledge. So they run into paradox. A constant why arises in the mind of the intelligent. When this why is answered by life to a person's satisfaction, that person goes on further and further, penetrating through all different planes of life. But when this why does not get a satisfactory answer from life, then doubt, dismay, and dissatisfaction arise and result in confusion, puzzle, and despair. So a constant why arises in the mind of the intelligent. Why is the question of intelligence. It shows us an intelligent person always asks why. An intelligent child is very annoying, as we all know. Constantly, why? But it's a great question. What becomes annoying to us is that we don't know the answers. And it's constantly coming, but there's a point at which you don't know why. And that's a perfect illustration of our own unknowing. We're uncomfortable with it. But it's a mark of intelligence to ask why. Now he says, and when this why is answered by life to a person's satisfaction, that person goes on further and further, penetrating through different planes of life. I don't think that's exactly how it sounds. People tend to stop when they've got a satisfactory answer to their why. What he's saying here is that when there's a satisfactory answer to one why, that's the foundation for building the next question, moving to the next question. So really what he's setting up here is that there's an endless why being asked on the path of unknowing. But when this why does not get a satisfactory answer, then doubt comes in. Sometimes belief proves to be worse than disbelief when a person, set in their beliefs, hinders their own progress, not allowing the mind to go further in the research of life, refusing all guidance and advice from another in order that one may preserve one's own belief. So that's what we were talking about before, where belief actually becomes an arrogant barrier. Belief is a hindrance if it's fixed. Also, a person who wants to hold on to it as a mark of somehow solidifying their own ego is going to have it exploded over time. Thus, a belief which is preserved as a virtue becomes the greatest sin. I have this belief. Look, I have this belief. Preserved as a virtue, it becomes the greatest sin. Both belief and disbelief by practice in time become natural tendencies. The person who is inclined to believe gets into the habit of believing all things and everything. And an unbeliever in time comes to disbelieve everything, whether right or wrong. The optimistic temperament is the temperament of the believer, and pessimism is, as a rule, the nature of the unbeliever. Now, the prophets have always promised a reward for the believer and have threatened the unbeliever with punishment because the chance for spiritual enlightenment was only in the life of the believer. For the unbelievers cover their soul by their own disbelief. So, among spiritual teachings, the emphasis is put on belief because you're not going to make any progress if you start with disbelief. My own teacher would say, when you're starting on a path, leave aside the philosophical questions. If you try to solve all your philosophical questions before you start on a path, you'll never start. Take some steps. If you're so untrusting as to not take the hand of somebody who says, well, let me lead you into this room and we'll look at this room together, you'll never see the room. You're just standing outside saying, what's in the room? What's in the room? There could be lions in there. I won't ever go in there. You have to put a head in. You have to put a foot in. And so if we try to answer all of our questions before we start on something, instead of learning by experience, we never start. So the prophets, the teachers, the unfolders of the revelation, always put the value on belief first. Disbelief is what comes after, as he's been saying. Break down the original belief, and then there's room for a new belief to be born.
You heard my question.
I did.
Is the faculty that engages in belief distinct from intellect in a traditional sense, or is it an aspect of intellect?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, the way it's being framed here is it's a faculty for acquisition. Is that intellect? It's an aspect of intellect, of course, that we have a faculty for acquiring information.
When we make something intelligible, it seems that believing it tends to be part of the intrinsic to the act. Remember, once I was on a retreat and there was a painting in the room where we had meetings, and it was an allegory of saving souls. And I think there were Catholics and Protestants in these boats. It was a Buddhist retreat, but it was a Christian retreat center. And anyway, in the foreground there was a character in a boat with his back to the point of view of the painting. And I noticed I kept wanting to turn around so I could see who he was, even that I couldn't help but believe. Just sort of seeing the painting, I was in that world, and it sort of illustrated the general principle.
You believed he had a face. You believed that he had a face, too.
Yes, I believed that he was real, and therefore, there was another side. And I think that was very telling to me. It seems that all of our intelligibility faculties, perception, intellect, tend to